The Crimean Peninsula, projecting into the Black Sea, has long held strategic significance. Its location allowed control over maritime routes and served as a natural bastion guarding the southern approaches to Russia and Ukraine. Sevastopol, founded in 1783 as the principal base of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, became the centerpiece of this geography. Its deep-water port, extensive fortifications, and naval facilities made it one of the most heavily defended positions in the region. During the Crimean War of 1853-1856, the city had already earned a reputation as a fortress, enduring an 11-month siege by British, French, and Ottoman forces. This historical memory informed both Soviet defensive planning and German strategic calculations in the Second World War. By 1941, Sevastopol once again held critical importance. For the Soviet Union, it was the home of the Black Sea Fleet, which comprised more than 200 warships, including the battleship Parizhskaya Kommuna, several cruisers, and a flotilla of destroyers and submarines. The fleet provided a secure line of communication with the Caucasus and served as a base for striking Axis, shipping, and coastal positions. The city's fortifications included coastal artillery batteries, underground bunkers, and multiple defensive lines constructed in the 1930s. With a pre-war population of over 100,000 and the presence of tens of thousands of naval personnel, Sevastopol represented both a military stronghold and a symbol of Soviet power in the Black Sea. For Germany and its allies, capturing Sevastopol was part of a broader strategy. After launching Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the Wehrmacht advanced deep into Soviet territory. Army Group South, under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, was tasked with seizing Ukraine, the Donbas industrial region, and eventually the Caucasus. Control of Crimea was essential to secure the German southern flank, protect oil supply routes in Romania, and eliminate the Soviet fleet's ability to threaten Axis positions. Adolf Hitler personally emphasized the need to occupy Crimea, referring to it as an unsinkable aircraft carrier that endangered Romanian oil fields at Ploiești. The initial German plan did not prioritize Crimea. However, as the campaign developed, the vulnerability of Army Group South's left flank became apparent. In September 1941, the German 11th Army, commanded by General Erich von Manstein from November, was assigned the task of conquering the peninsula. The 11th Army consisted of approximately 200,000 men, including German infantry divisions and Romanian units. They faced the Soviet 51st Army, numbering about 235,000 troops with around 600 tanks and 700 aircraft, supported by naval forces. The terrain of Crimea, dominated by narrow isthmuses, mountains in the south, and open steppe in the north, favored defense and complicated offensive maneuvers. Sevastopol's defenders prepared for a potential siege even before German forces reached Crimea. The Black Sea Fleet's commander, Admiral Filip Oktyabrski, coordinated with General Ivan Petrov of the separate coastal army to strengthen fortifications. Civilians were mobilized for construction of trenches, bunkers, and artillery positions. The city's arsenal included heavy naval guns capable of striking inland targets up to 30 kilometers away. Morale was high, with both military personnel and civilians aware of Sevastopol's symbolic importance. Propaganda emphasized its history of resistance, framing the defense. The broader geopolitical environment also shaped the coming battle. Romania, allied with Germany, sought to expand its territory and secure its oil-rich regions. Romanian divisions were deployed alongside German troops in Crimea, marking one of the largest contributions of Axis allies on the Eastern Front. For the Soviets, retaining Sevastopol was crucial not only militarily, but politically. The loss of Ukraine and the threat to Moscow in late 1941 placed immense pressure on the Soviet government, making the defense of symbolic strongholds like Sevastopol vital for maintaining morale. As autumn 1941 progressed, German and Romanian forces advanced into Crimea, defeating Soviet field armies and driving them toward the southern coast. By November, most of the peninsula was under Axis control. In this period, Sevastopol would endure repeated assaults, massive bombardments, and isolation from the rest of the Soviet front, while its defenders relied on the Black Sea Fleet and coastal fortifications to resist. Thus, the preconditions of the battle were defined by strategic necessity on both sides. For Germany and its allies, the capture of Sevastopol was essential to secure the southern flank and enable the drive toward the Caucasus. For the Soviet Union, the defense of the fortress symbolized resistance and ensured the continued presence of the Black Sea Fleet. The confrontation combined land, sea, and air operations involving hundreds of thousands of troops, massive artillery, and the participation of naval forces, making it one of the most complex and consequential sieges of the war. The opening phase of the battle for Sevastopol began in late October 1941, when German and Romanian, the Soviet 51st Army, tasked with defending the approaches, attempted to hold a fortified line supported by natural obstacles, but it was outmaneuvered and overrun. German infantry divisions, supported by artillery and air units from Luftwaffe 4, penetrated the defenses within days, compelling Soviet forces to retreat southward across the peninsula. The rapid collapse of Soviet field positions placed enormous pressure on the separate coastal army, which was withdrawn from Odessa after its evacuation and ordered to reinforce Sevastopol. By mid-November, the Axis had secured most of Crimea. Simferopol, the regional capital, fell on 1st November, followed by Kerch on 16th November. The remnants of Soviet forces withdrew in disarray, many lacking heavy weapons or transportation. The 11th Army, however, was itself strained by extended supply lines and limited mobility. Manstein, who assumed command on 17th November, recognized the challenge. The city lay at the southwestern tip of the peninsula, surrounded by natural defenses, steep hills, ravines, and heavily fortified positions. Moreover, the Black Sea Fleet ensured that Soviet defenders could be reinforced and supplied from the sea, complicating any attempt at rapid encirclement. The Soviet defenders numbered approximately 106,000 men by late November, organized into the separate coastal army under General Ivan Petrov and supported by the Black Sea Fleet. Their artillery park included not only standard field guns, but also coastal batteries mounting naval-caliber weapons, such as the 305mm guns of Battery 30 and the 180mm guns of Battery 35. These positions were reinforced by underground bunkers and extensive trench systems, creating multiple defensive lines. The defenders also possessed around... On 30th October, German advance elements reached the outer defensive perimeter of Sevastopol. Initial attempts to probe the defenses revealed their strength. Infantry assaults against coastal batteries were repelled, with German units suffering heavy casualties. The Luftwaffe launched bombing raids against harbor facilities and fortifications, but Soviet anti-aircraft fire and fighter cover inflicted losses. The city itself came under bombardment, with civilians enduring air raids and artillery shelling. Despite the destruction, morale remained firm, as the memory of Odessa's defense and the city's historical role as a fortress inspired determination. The Black Sea Fleet played a decisive role in the opening phase. On 4th November, transports from Novorossiysk and Tuapse brought in reinforcements and supplies, ensuring that the garrison's strength. Submarines operated off the Crimean coast, harassing Axis supply lines and disrupting shipping. These naval operations allowed Sevastopol to remain connected with the Soviet mainland, despite the encirclement of the rest of Crimea. The first German assault on Sevastopol began on 30 October and lasted until 23 November. Manstein committed multiple infantry divisions, supported by artillery and air bombardments, to break through the northern and eastern defenses. The attacks targeted key positions such as Belbek Valley and the Sapun Heights. Despite localized penetrations, the Germans were unable to achieve a decisive breakthrough. Soviet counterattacks, combined with artillery fire from coastal batteries, halted the assaults. By late November, The 11th Army had suffered heavy losses, over 8,000 casualties, and lacked the strength to continue. Manstein called off the offensive, ordering his troops to entrench and prepare for a renewed effort once reinforcements and supplies could be brought forward. For the Soviets, the successful defense of Sevastopol in November was a critical morale booster. At a time when the Wehrmacht was advancing on Moscow and much of Ukraine had fallen, the fortress on the Black Sea demonstrated the Red Army's ability to resist. Propaganda emphasized the heroism of the defenders, while Stavka prioritized continued reinforcement of the garrison. The population, numbering around 80,000 civilians, contributed directly to the defense by constructing fortifications, manning support roles, and enduring the hardships of siege warfare. The opening phase thus ended with Sevastopol still in Soviet hands, despite the Axis conquest of the rest of Crimea. The Germans had underestimated the strength of the city's defense. The Soviet garrison, though battered, had demonstrated resilience, and the stage was set for a prolonged siege. The failure of the initial assault forced Manstein to reconsider his approach, planning more deliberate operations that would rely on massive artillery and air support in the months to come. Strategic planning for the struggle over Sevastopol began in earnest after the failure of the 11th Army's first assault in November 1941. General Erich von Manstein recognized that the fortress was far stronger than German intelligence had estimated. The combination of natural terrain, modern fortifications, and the Black Sea Fleet's support meant that a swift breakthrough was unlikely. Instead, he envisioned a prolonged siege relying on concentrated artillery, air power, and carefully coordinated infantry assaults. The experience of Odessa's defense, where Soviet forces had held out against Romanian troops for more than 2 months, the German strategic goal was clear: the destruction of Sevastopol as a Soviet naval base and the elimination of the separate coastal army. Securing Crimea would protect Axis access to Romanian oil fields at Ploiești, safeguard supply routes along the Black Sea coast, and free the 11th Army for operations in the Caucasus in 1942. Manstein pressed Berlin for heavy artillery reinforcements and specialized equipment, arguing that only siege weapons could neutralize the fortress's defenses. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht agreed, dispatching railway guns and super-heavy mortars, including the 600mm Karl mortars and the 800mm Dora gun, the largest artillery piece used in the war. These weapons required extensive logistical preparations, including construction of special rail lines and ammunition storage sites. For the Soviets, strategic planning centered on maintaining the fortress as long as possible. The separate coastal army, under General Ivan Petrov, coordinated with Admiral Filip Oktyabrski of the Black Sea Fleet to integrate land and sea defenses. Stavka ordered that Sevastopol be held at all costs, both for its strategic value and symbolic importance. The Soviet High Command understood that the defense of the fortress tied down significant German forces that might otherwise be committed to Moscow or the Caucasus. Supplies and reinforcements continued to arrive by sea, despite heavy Luftwaffe attacks on convoys. Between December 1941 and May 1942, the fleet delivered more than 80,000 reinforcements, 100 tanks, 600 artillery pieces, and 20,000 tons of ammunition and supplies. German planning was complicated by the commitment of resources elsewhere. The 11th Army was isolated in Crimea, supplied only by a limited rail line across the Perekop Isthmus and through Romanian-controlled territory. The Army had to share Luftwaffe assets with other fronts, particularly as Army Group South fought around Kharkov and prepared for operations toward the Caucasus. Nevertheless, Manstein received priority for artillery and engineering support, as Hitler insisted on the importance of capturing Sevastopol. The Germans also relied heavily on Romanian troops, who formed a significant portion of the forces besieging the city. Romanian divisions provided manpower for holding operations, though they lacked the heavy weapons needed for assaults on fortifications. Soviet preparations were equally extensive. Engineers expanded defensive lines, with three major belts surrounding the city. The outer zone stretched across hills and valleys north and east of Sevastopol, reinforced by minefields and anti-tank obstacles. The second line ran closer to the city, incorporating fortified positions on the Sapun Heights and Inkerman. The innermost defenses included coastal batteries and bunkers embedded in the rocky terrain. Naval artillery provided long-range fire support, with batteries 30 and 35 capable of engaging targets 25 to 30 kilometers inland. Soviet air units, though generally outnumbered, operated from airfields in the Caucasus, conducting raids against German positions and protecting supply convoys. Propaganda played a central role on both sides. The German command emphasized the inevitability of Sevastopol's fall, portraying the siege as a demonstration of German engineering and firepower. Soviet propaganda, in contrast, celebrated the defenders as heirs to the legacy of the Crimean War, when Sevastopol had resisted Western armies for nearly a year. Newspapers and broadcasts highlighted stories of civilians and sailors contributing to the defense, reinforcing morale during months of bombardment. Both sides also made miscalculations. The Germans underestimated the ability of the Black Sea Fleet to sustain the garrison, assuming that air superiority would cut the sea lanes. Despite repeated Luftwaffe raids, Soviet ships continued to reach the harbor, often at night or under escort. The Soviets, for their part, overestimated the ability of their forces in Crimea outside Sevastopol to resist. In December 1941, Soviet attempts to retake Kerch and relieve pressure on Sevastopol failed, exposing the fortress to isolation. These offensive operations drained resources that might have been used to strengthen the garrison further. By spring 1942, strategic preparations were nearing completion. The Germans amassed over 200,000 men, 1,300 artillery pieces, and hundreds of aircraft for the coming assault, alongside Romanian divisions assigned to secondary roles. The Soviets defended with around 100,000 men, supported by more than 600 artillery. The stage was set for one of the most intense sieges of the war, where artillery barrages of unprecedented scale would test the endurance of both defenders and attackers. Strategic planning on both sides reflected the importance of Sevastopol, not only as a military target, but as a symbol whose fate would resonate across the entire Eastern Front. The first major clashes around Sevastopol began in November 1941 and intensified through the winter months. After the fall of the rest of Crimea, the city stood as the last major Soviet stronghold on the peninsula. German and Romanian forces reached the outer defenses by the end of October and quickly discovered that Sevastopol was far more formidable than anticipated. The fortress combined natural terrain obstacles with extensive man-made fortifications and the heavy guns of the Black Sea Fleet. Attempts at a rapid breakthrough faltered, and the conflict developed into a siege. The initial German assault, launched between 30 October and 21 November 1941, targeted the northern approaches along the Belbek Valley and the eastern defenses near Balaklava. Infantry divisions, supported by artillery and Luftwaffe bombers, attempted to storm fortified positions. Soviet coastal batteries, particularly Battery 30 with its twin 305mm guns, inflicted heavy losses on advancing troops. German units managed to seize several villages and high ground, but could not penetrate the main defensive belts. Casualties mounted, over 8,000 German losses compared to around 5,000 Soviet, and Manstein called off the offensive to reorganize. This marked the first indication that Sevastopol would not fall quickly. Throughout December 1941, both sides shifted their strategies. For the Soviets, the Black Sea Fleet became a lifeline. Warships transported reinforcements and convoys often sailed under cover of night, protected by submarines and aircraft. Despite constant Luftwaffe raids, thousands of soldiers and tons of equipment reached the city. Between December and January alone, more than 20,000 reinforcements were landed, including the 388th Rifle Division and additional artillery regiments. These fresh troops strengthened the garrison, which numbered around 106,000 men by early winter. German forces consolidated their positions and prepared for a second assault. In December, Manstein redirected his attention temporarily to the Kerch Peninsula, where Soviet amphibious landings threatened to outflank his army. 3 Soviet armies landed in eastern Crimea on 26 December, establishing a bridgehead at Kerch and Feodosia. This forced Manstein to halt his offensive against Sevastopol and redeploy divisions eastward. For the defenders of the fortress, this provided critical respite. Soviet propaganda hailed the Kerch landings as proof that the Red Army was regaining the initiative, while in Sevastopol morale soared as the pressure eased. In January 1942, the Soviets launched local counterattacks around Sevastopol. Using ski battalions and small tank detachments, they attempted to push German forces away from their defensive belts. These efforts achieved limited success, recapturing some forward positions and disrupting German supply lines. Civilians participated in the defense, constructing additional trenches, bunkers, and obstacles. Women and teenagers carried ammunition, repaired fortifications, and manned support roles. The civilian population, estimated at 80,000, endured shortages, constant bombardments, and the destruction of housing, yet contributed significantly to sustaining the garrison. The Luftwaffe intensified its bombing campaign during this phase. Daily raids struck the harbor. On 29 December, German bombers sank the transport Armenia, killing thousands of evacuees and medical personnel. Despite these losses, Soviet naval supply operations continued. The resilience of the sea lifeline frustrated German planners, who had expected to cut Sevastopol off entirely. Soviet submarines and aircraft also harassed Axis shipping in the Black Sea, complicating German logistics. The early months of 1942 were characterized by a war of attrition. German artillery bombarded defensive lines, while Soviet batteries returned fire, often using naval guns to suppress enemy concentrations. The city became a battlefield of constant exchanges, with artillery duels shaking the ground day and night. The defenders' strongpoints, such as the Sapun Heights, Inkerman Quarry, and the Maxim Gorky fortifications, resisted repeated German assaults. German infantry probed for weakness. One of the key turning points in this period was the failure of the Soviet Kerch campaign. Although the landings in December 1941 had relieved Sevastopol, by May 1942, the Germans launched Operation Trappenjagd, Bustard Hunt, and eliminated the Kerch bridgehead, capturing over 170,000 Soviet troops. This freed Manstein to concentrate the full strength of the 11th Army against Sevastopol. From this point forward, the fortress stood alone, isolated except for the sea, facing the prospect of a massive and sustained assault. The first engagements thus revealed the nature of the battle to come. Sevastopol would not fall to quick infantry assaults, but would require systematic reduction through siege warfare. Both sides adapted accordingly. The Germans concentrated artillery and prepared heavy weapons, while the Soviets relied on naval supply, deep fortifications, and the determination of their troops and civilians. The clash in late 1941 and early 1942 laid the foundation for the decisive battles of the summer, when the full weight of German siege artillery, air power, and infantry assaults would be unleashed against the Black Sea fortress. By the spring of 1942, the siege of Sevastopol had entered a period of escalation and crisis. The city had endured months of bombardment and repeated attacks, but the fall of the Kerch Peninsula in May dramatically altered the balance. Operation Trappenjagd, launched by the 11th Army, destroyed Soviet forces on the eastern edge of Crimea, eliminating over 170,000 men, capturing 1,000 guns, and removing the last external threat to German control of the peninsula. With the Kerch front liquidated, Manstein was able to concentrate all available resources against Sevastopol. The fortress, for the Germans and their Romanian allies, the escalation meant gathering an unprecedented concentration of firepower. The 11th Army, reinforced to approximately 200,000 men, assembled 2,300 artillery pieces, including some of the heaviest weapons in existence. Among these were the 600mm Karl Gerät mortars and the 800mm Dora railway gun, capable of firing 7-ton shells over 40 kilometers. These weapons were supplemented by hundreds of medium and heavy field guns, howitzers, and rocket launchers. The Luftwaffe committed Fliegerkorps E-8 under General Wolfram von Richthofen, providing around 600 aircraft for bombing raids. Manstein's strategy hinged on overwhelming the Soviet defenses through a combination of artillery and air power before committing infantry to capture key positions. For the Soviets, the crisis was immediate and severe. The separate coastal army, numbering around 106,000 men in June, General Ivan Petrov commanded the land forces, while Admiral Philip Oktyabrski coordinated naval operations. Supplies and reinforcements continued to arrive by sea, but German air superiority increasingly disrupted convoys. Between January and May, the Black Sea Fleet delivered 46,000 soldiers, 15,000 tons of ammunition, and hundreds of guns. However, by June, Luftwaffe bombers had sunk or damaged several transports, tightening the siege. Soviet air strength was limited to around 200 aircraft, many obsolete compared to German fighters and dive bombers. The morale of Sevastopol's defenders remained high but was under constant strain. Civilians endured shortages of food and water, while artillery fire reduced large sections of the city to rubble. Many families lived in Soviet propaganda emphasized the historical legacy of Sevastopol, reminding soldiers and civilians of the Crimean War defense of 1854-1855. The idea of the city as a fortress that must not fall was deeply ingrained. The German bombardment began on 2 June 1942, initiating Operation Sturmfang, the final assault on Sevastopol. Over the course of 5 days, more than 500,000 shells and bombs were fired or dropped on Soviet positions. The bombardment was described by German records as one of the most intense of the entire war. The Luftwaffe alone flew 3,000 sorties in the first week, targeting coastal batteries, supply depots, and defensive strongpoints. The super heavy artillery concentrated on Battery 30 and Battery 35, whose 305mm and 1mm guns represented the core of Soviet coastal defense. Although these batteries sustained, the Soviet response during this escalation involved local counterattacks and desperate defensive actions. Units rotated through the front lines to replace losses, while artillery concentrated fire on German assembly areas. Naval guns provided support whenever weather and ammunition supplies allowed. The Black Sea Fleet attempted to resupply the city with additional reinforcements in mid-June, but convoys came under sustained air attack, losing several transports and escorts. Despite these losses, thousands of troops and tons of ammunition still reached the port, prolonging the resistance. By mid-June, the crisis deepened, as German infantry began assaulting the outer defensive lines. Divisions supported by assault engineers and flamethrowers attacked strongpoints such as the Inkerman Quarry and the Sapun Heights. Fighting was characterized by close-quarters combat in trenches, bunkers, and caves. German reports noted fierce resistance, with Soviet defenders often fighting to the last man. The presence of naval infantry brigades, hardened by earlier battles in Odessa and Crimea, added to the determination of the defense. Internationally, the siege of Sevastopol drew attention as a major struggle on the Eastern Front. For the Axis, its capture was presented as a matter of prestige and a necessary step for securing the Black Sea. For the Soviets, the defense was highlighted in broadcasts and foreign reports as proof of Soviet resilience. The battle also had a direct impact on strategic planning. German High Command delayed the launch of Case Blue, the summer offensive toward the Caucasus, until Sevastopol was eliminated. This delay, lasting several weeks, altered the timing of operations that would culminate in Stalingrad later in the year. By late June, both sides were fully committed to the escalating struggle. The Germans had deployed nearly all available heavy artillery and air power, while the Soviets concentrated their last reserves in the fortress. Casualties mounted daily. German reports indicated losses of 20,000 by mid-June, while Soviet losses were even higher, with divisions reduced to a fraction of their initial strength. Despite this, the defense continued, demonstrating the capacity of fortified positions to resist even the most massive concentrations of firepower. The escalation of the battle thus marked a turning point. Sevastopol, once an outpost supplied from the sea, was now a fortress under relentless siege. The Germans were determined to crush it as a precondition for their southern campaign, while the Soviets were equally determined to hold as long as possible, tying down enemy forces and inspiring resistance elsewhere. The crisis in June 1942 was the peak of the siege of Sevastopol came in June 1942, when Operation Sturfang unfolded with the full force of the 11th Army and its massive arsenal of artillery and aircraft. After months of preparation and weeks of bombardment, the Germans launched their largest and most coordinated assault on the fortress. The battle reached its height between 17 June and early July, as German divisions, supported by the Luftwaffe and super-heavy guns, attempted to crush the Soviet defenses line by line. At the start of the main offensive, Manstein commanded approximately 200,000 troops, including German and Romanian formations. His force was supported by more than 1,300 artillery pieces, 600 aircraft, and unique weapons such as the 600 mm Karl mortars and the 800 mm Dora railway gun. Against them stood around 106,000 Soviet troops of the separate coastal army under General Ivan Petrov. The defenders had about 600 artillery pieces, 40 tanks, and a dwindling number of aircraft, while naval batteries remained the backbone of long-range firepower. The German assault focused on three sectors. In the north, attacks targeted the Belbek Valley and strongpoints around Battery 30. In the east, divisions pressed toward the Sapun Heights and the Inkerman Quarry, vital positions controlling approaches to the city. In the south, Romanian divisions supported German thrusts against Balaclava and the coastal defenses. Every advance was preceded by intense artillery barrages and waves of Luftwaffe bombing sorties. By late June, German artillery had fired over 2 million shells, while the Luftwaffe conducted nearly 24,000 sorties during the operation. The fighting reached extraordinary intensity in positions such as the Sapun Heights. German infantry, supported by assault engineers with flamethrowers and demolition charges, assaulted bunkers and trenches under covering fire. Soviet defenders responded with counterattacks, often at close range, supported by the fire of coastal batteries. Battery 30 and Battery 35, despite repeated bombardments, continued to operate, firing on German troop concentrations and supply lines. The durability of these fortifications, constructed of reinforced concrete and embedded in rock, forced the Germans into costly assaults that advanced only meters at a time. In the harbor, the Black Sea Fleet maintained its role despite relentless air attacks. Cruisers and destroyers shelled German positions, while transports attempted to bring reinforcements and evacuate wounded. On 26 June, Luftwaffe dive bombers sank the destroyer Tashkent, which had been a vital link in supplying the garrison. Other transports also fell victim to bombing raids, reducing the volume of supplies entering the city. Still, the fleet managed to deliver thousands of tons of civilian suffering intensified during this phase. Large parts of the city were reduced to rubble by artillery and air raids. Food shortages became critical, and medical supplies ran dangerously low. Civilians lived in caves and shelters, often alongside soldiers, contributing to the defense by carrying ammunition, repairing positions, and treating casualties. The entire population was effectively mobilized, blurring the line between military and civilian roles. By the end of June, German forces achieved significant breakthroughs. On 17 June, they stormed the Inkerman Heights, capturing key defensive positions. By 23 June, German divisions penetrated deep into the second defensive line, while Romanian units secured Balaclava and coastal approaches. Battery 30 was silenced after a week of bombardment, and Battery 35 was heavily damaged, though it remained operational until early July. Despite desperate counterattacks, the Soviet defenders were being ground down. Ammunition shortages forced artillery units to ration shells, while infantry divisions were reduced to a fraction of their strength. The Luftwaffe achieved near-total dominance in the skies, intercepting Soviet aircraft attempting to defend supply convoys or strike German artillery. Manstein committed reserves to exploit breaches, steadily tightening the ring around the city. By the last week of June, German forces stood within the outskirts of Sevastopol. The Sapun Heights fell after heavy fighting, opening the route into the city from the east. German artillery turned its fire on the harbor, sinking ships at anchor and preventing further large-scale resupply. Soviet commanders prepared for final resistance, withdrawing forces into the inner city and coastal fortifications. The Black Sea Fleet began evacuating wounded and non-essential personnel, though thousands remained trapped. The peak of the campaign demonstrated the overwhelming concentration of firepower the Germans could bring to bear against a fortified position. Yet it also showed the extraordinary resilience of the Soviet defenders, who held out under conditions that would have broken many garrisons. By early July 1942, Sevastopol was reduced to ruins, but fighting continued street by street. The fortress that had resisted for 8 months was nearing its end, but only after one of the most intense sieges of the Second World War. Resistance and adaptation defined the final weeks of the defense of Sevastopol. Even as German forces pressed deep into the fortress in late June 1942, Soviet commanders sought to reorganize shattered formations and prolong resistance. General Ivan Petrov's separate coastal army, supported by Admiral Philip Oktyabrski and the Black Sea Fleet, continued to coordinate defenses despite collapsing communications. Units that had been reduced to a few hundred men attempted local counterattacks, while engineers converted cellars, caves, and underground quarries into improvised strongpoints. Ammunition shortages forced artillery units to fire sparingly, while infantry relied increasingly on close-quarters weapons such as grenades, Molotov cocktails, and bayonets. Adaptation took many forms. Coastal batteries, once vital for long-range fire, were used until their destruction as fortified bunkers. Battery 35, heavily damaged by repeated bombardment, continued to function until 2nd July, when its last gun was disabled. Before its fall, gunners dismantled surviving pieces, turned them into improvised anti-tank weapons, and destroyed remaining ammunition to prevent capture. Soviet naval infantry, accustomed to amphibious warfare, fought as elite infantry in the ruins of the city, defending block by block. Civilians, many of whom had been mobilized throughout the siege, now worked in evacuation efforts, cared for the wounded, and even joined armed detachments to support soldiers in holding barricades and trenches. German tactics also adapted. The 11th Army shifted from broad assaults to concentrated thrusts against specific sectors. Assault engineers used flamethrowers and explosives to clear bunkers, while Stuka dive bombers provided precision strikes against fortified positions. Infantry divisions advanced in small groups, exploiting weak points created by artillery fire. Romanian units secured captured areas, freeing German divisions for renewed attacks. Manstein emphasized methodical reduction of resistance rather than risking high casualties in frontal attacks, though the fighting remained costly. Partisan operations behind the lines played a minor but symbolically important role. In the Crimean mountains and countryside, small partisan groups harassed German supply routes and provided intelligence to the garrison. Though their direct impact on the siege was limited, they forced the Axis to divert troops to rear security, complicating logistics at a critical stage. Inside Sevastopol, some underground cells attempted sabotage and maintained morale through clandestine publications and communications. Psychologically, the defenders endured enormous strain. After 8 months of constant bombardment, food and medical supplies were almost exhausted. Hospitals overflowed, often operating without electricity or anesthesia. Soldiers rotated between the front lines and rear shelters with little rest, yet morale, though weakened, did not collapse. Soviet command framed the defense as a national duty, broadcasting messages that emphasized the sacrifice of Sevastopol's defenders. Even as defeat became inevitable, the order remained to fight to the last. The Black Sea Fleet continued to attempt resupply and evacuation, though at great cost. On 27th of June, the cruiser Molotov and destroyer Biditelny brought ammunition into the harbor under heavy air attack. Subsequent missions evacuated wounded soldiers and key personnel. Admiral Oktyabrski eventually received orders to evacuate senior commanders, including Petrov, to preserve leadership for future operations. This decision, controversial at the time, left many defenders without their highest officers, but ensured continuity of command for the Soviet war effort elsewhere. Adaptation also took place on the German side of logistics. Supplying super heavy guns such as Dora required thousands of men and kilometers of rail track. Ammunition for the weapon weighed several tons per shell, and the operation of firing required days of preparation. Despite its symbolic role, Dora achieved limited military effect, destroying some ammunition depots and underground positions but failing to collapse major fortifications. In practice, it was concentrated infantry assaults, combined with massed airstrikes that reduced Soviet positions. By late June, Soviet units adapted by breaking into smaller, semi-independent groups, holding isolated sectors of the city. These pockets fought without direct communication with higher command, relying on local initiative. The defenders used the city's terrain, ravines, quarries, and ruins to create successive fallback positions. Each strongpoint delayed the German advance, even as overall resistance weakened. The final adaptation came in the form of evacuation under fire. Between 1 and 3 July, the Black Sea Fleet evacuated thousands of wounded and several senior commanders. However, the majority of the garrison, numbering more, many fought until their positions were overrun. Others attempted to break out into the countryside. The last organized resistance collapsed in early July, but scattered groups continued to fight in caves and tunnels for days. Resistance and adaptation during the last phase of Sevastopol's defense demonstrated the ability of Soviet forces to prolong a hopeless struggle, tying down significant Axis resources and delaying the German summer offensive. Though the fortress would fall, the defense left a legacy of determination and sacrifice that became central to Soviet wartime memory. The battle also highlighted the limits of German siege warfare, where even overwhelming firepower required months of attrition to overcome a determined, well-fortified garrison. The turning point of the siege arrived in late June and early July 1942, when the accumulated weight of German artillery, air power, and after weeks of continuous bombardment, Soviet strongpoints that had resisted since November 1941 were systematically destroyed or isolated. The fall of Battery 30 in late June and the silencing of Battery 35 on the 2nd July marked decisive moments. These fortifications, armed with heavy naval caliber guns, had anchored the outer belts of defense and provided long-range fire support. Once neutralized, the defenders lost their most powerful assets and German forces advanced into the heart of the city. The Luftwaffe played a central role in this phase. Fliegerkorps E8 under Wolfram von Richthofen flew over 20,000 sorties during the final month, focusing on bombing supply depots, command posts, and harbor installations. On 26 June, massed Stuka attacks destroyed much of the northern sector, while bombers struck ships in the port. The destroyer Tashkent, already damaged in earlier raids, was sunk while attempting to evacuate wounded. The reduction of the fleet's capacity to resupply the garrison meant that ammunition and food ran dangerously low. Soviet records indicate that by $30 June, some units had only a handful of artillery shells per gun, and rations reduced to a few hundred grams of bread per day. German ground assaults intensified after these bombardments. On 29 June, the 132nd Infantry Division captured the Sapun Heights, which dominated the approaches to the city. Romanian units advanced along the southern coast, seizing Balaclava and cutting off remaining Soviet positions from retreat to the east. German pioneers used flamethrowers and explosives to clear bunkers and caves, while infantry pressed through rubble-strewn streets. The Inkerman Heights fell after fierce fighting, giving the attackers control of another key defensive position. For the defenders, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Soviet divisions, once numbering thousands, were reduced to a few hundred effective men. Naval infantry brigades fought to the end, launching counterattacks with whatever weapons remained. Civilians joined in the defense of barricades and provided assistance to the wounded, but shortages of medicine and water created unbearable conditions. Hospitals operated without electricity, often in underground shelters filled with smoke and dust from constant bombardment. Despite exhaustion, many units held out until physically overrun. The turning point came not only on the battlefield, but also in the command structure. On 30th June, Admiral Filip Oktyabrski and senior staff evacuated by submarine and aircraft under orders from Moscow, leaving General Petrov and other officers in charge of remaining forces. On 1st July, Stavka authorized further evacuations of wounded and specialists, but German control of the skies limited these efforts. By 3rd July, organized German reports described capturing thousands of prisoners each day. By 4th July, approximately 90,000 Soviet soldiers and sailors had been taken prisoner, along with large numbers of civilians who could not be evacuated. Among the captives were senior officers, though many attempted to escape into the surrounding countryside. Soviet records indicate that fewer than 30,000 men were successfully evacuated during the final phase, leaving the majority of the garrison to be captured or killed. The fall of Sevastopol marked the end of an 8-month siege. Manstein reported the fortress captured on 4 July 1942, and Axis forces secured the city after clearing remaining resistance in caves and tunnels. The victory freed the 11th Army for redeployment, though at the cost of over 35,000 casualties. The Soviets lost the separate coastal army, most of their Black Sea Fleet's forward base, and tens of thousands of troops. The fortress that had tied down German and Romanian forces for months was finally subdued, but only after the most massive concentration of siege weapons employed on the Eastern Front. The turning point was therefore decisive in two senses. It represented the physical collapse of Sevastopol's defenses under overwhelming pressure, and it marked the psychological blow of losing the Black Sea fortress. Yet even in defeat, the prolonged resistance delayed German strategic plans, forcing the postponement of Case Blue, the summer offensive toward the Caucasus. The battle's conclusion thus carried repercussions far beyond Crimea, influencing the timing and resources available for operations that would shape the course of 1942. The aftermath of the fall of Sevastopol in July 1942 was marked by devastation, mass captivity, and strategic consequences felt far beyond Crimea. On 4th July, Manstein formally reported the capture of the city to Berlin. German troops paraded through the ruins of Sevastopol, while pockets of Soviet resistance continued for days in caves, quarries, and underground bunkers. These final holdouts were reduced by flamethrowers, explosives, and starvation. By mid-July, all organized resistance had ended, and the once formidable fortress lay in ruins. The human cost was immense. Of the approximately 106,000 Soviet defenders present at the beginning of June, about 90,000 were taken prisoner during the final days of the battle. Thousands more had been killed in combat or succumbed to wounds during the siege. Only around 30,000 men, mostly wounded and selected specialists, were successfully evacuated by sea and air in the last weeks. The Germans and Romanians captured immense quantities of war materiel, hundreds of artillery pieces, thousands of tons of ammunition, and surviving naval batteries, though many had been sabotaged by retreating Soviet troops. Axis losses were also significant, with the 11th Army suffering an estimated 35,000 casualties, including more than 8,000 dead. Romanian divisions bore particularly heavy losses, reflecting their role in coastal assaults and holding operations. The civilian population of Sevastopol endured catastrophic conditions. Before the siege, more than 100,000 civilians lived in the city. By its end, only a fraction remained. Many were evacuated early in the siege, but tens of thousands endured bombardments, shortages, and destruction. After the German occupation, civilians faced reprisals, deportations, and forced labor. The city itself was reduced to rubble, with entire districts flattened by artillery and air bombardments. Infrastructure, ports, and industrial facilities were destroyed or rendered unusable. Strategically, the capture of Sevastopol gave the Axis control of the entire Crimean Peninsula. The Black Sea Fleet, forced to withdraw to ports in the Caucasus, lost its main base and much of its ability to contest Axis dominance in the northern Black Sea. German propaganda hailed the victory as one of the great achievements of the Wehrmacht, emphasizing the scale of the siege and the strength of the fortress. Hitler awarded Manstein the rank of Field Marshal, making him one of the most celebrated commanders of the war at that time. Yet the consequences also revealed the limits of the victory. The prolonged siege had tied down the 11th Army and significant Luftwaffe assets for 8 months. The operation delayed the launch of Case Blue, the summer offensive toward the Caucasus, by several weeks. When the 11th Army was finally freed, it was too late to participate in the initial stages of the campaign. Only portions of its units were transferred to other fronts, while many divisions required rest and refitting after their losses at Sevastopol. The strategic timetable of the Wehrmacht's southern operations was thus indirectly shaped by the stubborn Soviet defense. For the Soviet Union, the loss of Sevastopol was a grave setback, but the defense became a symbol of sacrifice. Soviet propaganda quickly highlighted the length of resistance, 250 days, as evidence of the Red Army's determination. The defenders were portrayed as heroes whose actions delayed German plans and contributed to eventual Soviet successes. Commemorations of the hero city began even during the war, with veterans and civilians remembered for their role in one of the most protracted sieges of the conflict. In the immediate aftermath, Crimea became an occupied territory, with Sevastopol serving as a German naval base and a strong point for future operations. The population faced occupation policies that included forced requisitions, arrests of suspected partisans, and exploitation of resources. Soviet partisan activity increased in the Crimean Mountains, though their operations were limited by geography and German countermeasures. The humanitarian crisis, the scale of destruction, and the capture of tens of thousands of prisoners defined the aftermath of the battle. Sevastopol's fall marked both a tactical triumph for the Axis and a demonstration of Soviet resilience in defense. It left a city in ruins, a population traumatized, and armies depleted. The consequences extended across the Eastern Front, influencing the course of operations in 1942, and leaving a legacy of endurance that would resonate in Soviet and world memory long after the fighting had ceased. The legacy of the defense and fall of Sevastopol was profound, shaping military strategy, political narratives, and cultural memory for decades. On a purely military level, the 8-month defense demonstrated both the resilience. The German 11th Army, with around 200,000 men, over 2,300 artillery pieces, and the support of 600 aircraft, took nearly a year to subdue the fortress. Even with super-heavy weapons such as the 600mm Karl mortars and the 800mm Dora railway gun, success was only achieved through systematic destruction and attrition. For the Axis, the campaign highlighted both the potential of concentrated siege warfare and its limitations. Although Sevastopol fell, the cost in time and casualties weakened the 11th Army and delayed its redeployment for the summer campaign of 1942. For Germany, the victory was celebrated as a major achievement. Hitler elevated Erich von Manstein to Field Marshal in recognition of his role, and German propaganda portrayed the fall of Sevastopol as proof of Wehrmacht superiority. Yet the timing reduced its strategic value. The delay in launching Case Blue, combined with the exhaustion of the 11th Army, meant that this triumph contributed little to the broader objectives of capturing the Caucasus oil fields and advancing to the Volga. In retrospect, historians have argued that the resources consumed at Sevastopol may have weakened German capacity for operations elsewhere, particularly as the campaign in southern Russia intensified later in 1942. For the Soviet Union, the defense of Sevastopol became a symbol of sacrifice and resilience. Although the city was lost, the defenders held out for 250 days, tying down German and Romanian forces and delaying their operations. Soviet propaganda emphasized the heroism of the garrison and civilians, comparing the siege to the defense of the city during the Crimean War. The fortress was later awarded the honorary title of Hero City in 1945. The defense entered Soviet collective memory as one of the great stands of the war, shaping post-war commemorations, monuments, and literature. The humanitarian legacy was equally significant. Tens of thousands of civilians endured months of bombardment, shortages, and occupation. Many perished during the siege or in its aftermath, while survivors faced deportations, forced labor, and reprisals under German rule. The ruins of Sevastopol testified to the scale of destruction, with most of the city's infrastructure destroyed. After the war, reconstruction became a symbol of Soviet resilience, with massive efforts to rebuild both the port and the naval facilities. The defense also influenced military thought. For the Soviets, the experience underscored the importance of fortifications integrated with naval and air power, as well as the value of determined resistance in delaying. Lessons learned at Sevastopol informed later defensive operations at Stalingrad and Kursk, where coordination of combined arms and fortified positions played decisive roles. For the Germans, the siege reinforced an overconfidence in artillery and air bombardment as solutions to entrenched defenses, a lesson that proved misleading when applied against mobile Soviet defenses in later battles. In broader historical significance, the fall of Sevastopol marked the last major Axis victory in Crimea until 1944. When the Red Army returned, it did so with overwhelming strength, liberating the city in May 1944 after a massive offensive. The memory of the 1941-1942 defense was invoked to frame the recapture as both vengeance and redemption. Internationally, the prolonged resistance had already influenced perceptions of the Soviet war effort, convincing allies that the USSR could endure and contribute. Today, the legacy of Sevastopol's defense remains visible in monuments, museums, and cemeteries. The names of fortifications such as Battery 30 and Battery 35 became synonymous with endurance, while the city itself is remembered as a place of repeated sacrifice in Russian, Ukrainian, and wider European history. The siege stands as a reminder of the costs of total war, measured not only in strategic gains and losses, but in human endurance, destruction, and memory. The defense of Sevastopol in 1941 to 1942 thus holds a dual significance: militarily, as an example of one of the longest and most complex sieges of the Second World War, and culturally, as a symbol of resistance and suffering. Its legacy illustrates how fortress warfare, once considered obsolete, could still shape the course of campaigns, and how the memory of such battles could transcend their immediate outcome.